Welcome to Uncivil Law. What do you get when you mix a beloved friend star, a sketchy doctor, and a woman known as the ketamine queen? A tragedy that reads like a Hollywood thriller, but with real-life consequences. Unfortunately, this story is wilder than any Friends episode, and the stakes are life and death. Let's meet the players in our twisted tale. First up, we have Matthew Perry. Yes, Chandler Bing himself. But forget what you think you know about him. This isn't the sarcastic, lovable friend we grew up with on the show Friends. It turns out this was a man battling demons, desperately seeking relief in any form, and his drug of choice turned out to be one called ketamine. Our next player entered Dr. Salvador Plancia, aka Dr. P. Think of him as a more evil version of Dr. House. Brilliant, but with an even more compromised moral compass and one that's seriously out of whack. He's not helping people, he's feeding addictions for profit. The next person to enter our stage is none other than Yasmin Sanga, also known as the ketamine queen. Imagine if Walter White from Breaking Bad was a suburban mom with a penchant for designer handbags and deadly drugs. That's Sanga. Rounding out the main cast of this horror show is Kenneth Iswama, Perry's personal assistant. Think of him as Igor to Dr. Frankenstein, always there, always enabling, but with a twist in his psyche that makes his actions even more tragic. But wait, there's more, because we've got some supporting characters that help to flush out our main cast. As supporting players, we've got Eric Fleming, the middleman who could give Saul Goodman a run for his money, and Dr. Mark Chavez, another medical professional who seems to have misplaced his Hippocratic oath. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like the plot of a new Netflix series. But here's the sad kicker. It's all very real, and the consequences turned out to be deadly serious. But how did this motley crew come together in a conspiracy that would ultimately claim the life of one of Hollywood's brightest stars? Let's break it down, Law and Order style. Picture this. It's September 2023. Matthew Perry, struggling with addiction, is desperately seeking ketamine. Enter Dr. Placiena, who sees dollar signs instead of a patient in need. He reaches out to one of his sketchy colleagues, Dr. Chavez, and boom, our conspiracy's born. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dr. P doesn't just sell Perry the drugs. Oh no, that would be far too simple. Instead, he teaches Perry's assistant, Iwasama, how to inject the star with ketamine. It's like if your high school chemistry teacher decided to moonlight as a drug dealer and give you homework on how to cook meth. Meanwhile, Sanga, for her part, is running her own Breaking Bad operation right out of her suburban home. She's supplying the ketamine to Fleming, who's selling it to Iswama, who's injecting it into Perry. It's a twisted game of telephone, but instead of funny messages, they're passing around lethal doses of drugs. Now here's where the legal wheels start turning. All these actions, they add up to one big fat conspiracy charge. And in the eyes of the law, everyone's equally culpable, from the doctors writing fraudulent prescriptions to the assistant who administered the fatal dose. But let's zoom in on this a little bit so we can pay attention to some of the details. On September the 30th of 2023, Dr. P met Perry in his home, injected him with ketamine, and then leaves vials and syringes with Iwasama. It was like he was setting up a DIY drug den. Fast forward to October the 10th, and we've got Dr. P injecting Perry in a public parking lot in Long Beach. Talk about a house call gone wrong. And Sanga, she's not just dealing drugs, she's running the full-blown operation out of her home. The feds are calling it drug-involved premises. I like to refer to it as suburban Breaking Bad. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Let's dive a little bit more into the legal nitty-gritty that turns this Hollywood tragedy into a legal nightmare. We're talking multiple charges here, each more serious than the last. First up, conspiracy to distribute ketamine, which is a controlled substance. It's like the prosecutors are saying you all played for the same team in this deadly game. And the evidence? It's everywhere. From text messages to actual drug deals. It's the prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. But the heavyweight champion of charges in this case has to be the distribution of ketamine that resulted in death. This is the legal equivalent of a knockout punch. If proven, it could send Sanga and Fleming to prison for life. And let's not forget about Dr. Placiena's creative writing skills. Falsifying medical records? That's obstruction of justice, my friends. He tried to rewrite the scripts in this tragedy, but the feds have caught him red-handed. The defense attorneys are going to have their work cut out for them. They might try to argue that Perry's long history of addiction makes it impossible to prove that their client's drugs caused the death. It's a bit like blaming the straw that broke the camel's back when the poor camel was already carrying a mountain. But this kind of defense doesn't look particularly likely here because the prosecution has some pretty damning evidence. We're talking about specific text messages where Dr. P and Chavez discuss how much to charge Perry, calling him a moron. It's like they're setting up a lemonade stand, but instead of selling lemonade, they're selling lethal drugs. And Sanga? Well, she's got some history. Back in 2019, she sold ketamine to someone who died the next day. When she found out, she apparently Googled, can ketamine be listed as a cause of death? Talk about a guilty conscience. But beyond the legal drama and the courtroom drama, there is a human story here too, one that ended far too soon. October the 28th of 2023, a date that will live in infamy for Friends fans worldwide. Matthew Perry, the man who made us laugh for a decade, took his final breath. The cause? The ketamine overdose that his doctors facilitated. Let's rewind a little bit so we can talk a little bit more about Perry's slide into narcotics use. In the days leading up to his death, Perry was receiving apparently multiple ketamine injections per day. On October the 24th alone, Iwasama apparently gave him at least 6 shots. It's like watching a ticking time bomb, knowing that the explosion is coming, but being powerless to stop it. On that fateful day, Iwasama administered at least 3 more shots to Perry. The ketamine came from Sanga and Fleming, delivered through syringes provided by Dr. P. It's a deadly combination that reads like a twisted version of Ocean's 11. And here's the real kicker. After Perry's death hit the news, our ketamine queen Sanga called Fleming and apparently told him to delete all their text messages. It's like watching a criminal mastermind at work, but instead of a clean getaway, they left a trail a mile wide. It's a stark reminder of the real-world consequences of addiction and the people who profit from it. This isn't a storyline that can be wrapped up in a neat 22 minutes. There is no laugh track, no witty one-liner to ease the pain. In the end, we're left with a sobering truth. Even our brightest stars can fall victim to the darkness of addiction. And there will always be those who are willing to profit from that pain regardless of the consequences. Now, speaking of those consequences, let's talk a little bit more about what some of those consequences might be. If convicted, our cast of characters is looking at some serious times behind bars. Sanga could face a minimum of 10 years and up to life in prison just for the methamphetamine charge. Dr. P is looking at 10 years for each ketamine-related count and up to 20 years for each count of falsifying records. It's like they're playing a twisted game of Monopoly, but instead of collecting $200 for pass and go, they're racking up decades in federal prison. But the charges get even more interesting than that. The charges here aren't just about drugs. We're talking about money laundering, maintaining drug-involved premises, and obstruction of justice. It's like the prosecutor threw the entire law book at them and then some. The defense team will likely try to muddy the waters. After all, as I mentioned before, they could try to argue that these drugs weren't actually the drugs that caused the death. But that argument is a bit like arguing over which raindrop caused the flood. In the end, it's doubtful a jury will care. The prosecution has its mountains of evidence: text messages, drug transactions, and eyewitnesses' accounts. They're building a legal tower, and from over here so far, it looks pretty sturdy. As this case moves forward in the legal system, it serves as a grim reminder of the ongoing battle against drug addiction and those who exploit it. It's a story that's part medical drama, part crime thriller, and all about tragedy. This case isn't just about the death of a beloved actor. It's about the dark underbelly of addiction, the people who profit from it, and the devastating consequences that ripple out to every illicit drug deal. It's a wake-up call, wrapped up in a tragedy, disguised as a Hollywood scandal. But let me pose some questions to you to give you some things to think about. Do you think the medical professionals involved here should face harsher penalties than the non-medical defendants? How much responsibility do you think Matthew Perry bears for his own death, given his history of addiction? And what do you think about ketamine? Should it be more strictly regulated, or will that potentially harm patients who use it legitimately for depression or pain management? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And remember, while we may love to be entertained by courtroom dramas and crime thrillers, real-life cases like this remind us of the very real human cost behind these stories. Until next time, I've been Uncivil Law. Remember to keep it uncivil out there.